This is me asking Khanna a question about sanctions when I had him on Friday, and it was actually based on a question that Aaron Maté asked. I tweeted out I was going to have on Ro and asked for questions. And so here is what Ro said. Some people asked why you voted to impose sanctions on Nicaragua, and I would say that this is kind of a larger question, which I think that, Jeff Sachs, friend of the show, though he's not been on, but this is your invitation, Jeff Sachs. Brilliant person, friend of Bernie Sanders, right? It was part of his campaign. He and Mark Westbrot have written about the way that sanctions harm the civilian population. They don't actually harm the government. I mean, we've seen this in the cases of Cuba still standing, Castro still there. Is it not time for progressives and the progressive position to be anti-sanctions? Because kind of beyond what you think of those governments, whether or not you like them or not, it doesn't harm those governments. The government stays standing, and it's the civilians who die, who don't have access to medicine, who don't have access to life-saving medicine, to food. It just seems like this is like old school Reagan, or even, going back further, we could go back to Monroe Doctrine. This is not where we should be focusing our priorities now.
Well, Katie, I agree with you that some of the sanctions have been poorly designed. In fact, I worked with Mark Weisbrot on Venezuela, some of the sanctions there to make sure that they're not hurting the poorest people in Venezuela. And I would call on the State Department to implement sanctions in a way that goes after the regime in Nicaragua that has undoubtedly committed huge human rights abuses and is not a ethical actor, and not to design it in a way that's going to deprive people of medicine and deprive people of food. I believe you can structure sanctions in that way. I mean, even the left, even though, look, I disagree with the BDS movement, as you know, I don't think that that's a correct one, but they're advocating sanctions. So it's not like the left doesn't believe in sanctions as well. I think the question is, how do you target the sanctions?
Boycott, divest, sanction movement. Why are we okay with that? Because Israel. I know why. Because we're not really starving Israel, right? It's mostly a cultural boycott, and because we fund them so much. So this would be like if we really funded Ortega's government and then we impose sanctions.
I think we should have a sense of, you can have sanctions in ways that are targeted, that are going after people who are abusing power in Nicaragua's case, but ones that don't get at poor people and don't hurt poor people. And I think involve Mark Weisbrot, involve Jeffrey Sachs in how we better target sanctions. But I do think that it's important for us to speak consistently against the human rights violations in Nicaragua. Even those who may oppose the sanctions, I think that the left needs to be, in my opinion, very clear in saying, look, Ortega, some of the actions there are awful, and that they're human rights violations, that they should be condemned. And we shouldn't have a view that, it's not that bad. My view is that there are some pretty serious human rights violations.
I mean, Kerry just shook hands with Mohammed bin Salman, right? I mean, look what happened. We have an entire report showing that Khashoggi was indeed chopped up at the behest of the Saudi kingdom. And yet, what was Biden's response to that?
Well, look, I think we should have much more sanctions on MBS, and I don't think the administration has been strong enough on Yemen. I don't think they've been strong enough on holding MBS accountable. So I would say you should have sanctions in terms of Khashoggi. I mean, that'd be another example. If someone said, would you support sanctions on MBS in some way? I would say, yes, I would. The same reason I would support it in Nicaragua.
Do you have a comment on Khanna's comment?
First of all, he's being a flagrant hypocrite. So he says he opposes BDS on Israel, but he supports sanctions on Nicaragua because he says they've committed human rights abuses. Are you going to tell me that Israel, which has been occupying for decades an entire population against their will, no Palestinian voted for Israel to occupy them, steal their land, steal their homes, steal their water, kill their children. That Israel has committed less human rights abuses than Nicaragua, that Nicaragua somehow deserves sanctions but not Israel. It's insane. And basically what he's doing is he's legitimizing the neocon playbook, which has targeted Nicaragua for decades, not because of any human rights abuses, but because they're independent, because they don't want to live under the US dictatorship, basically. He's going along with that. He's basically in lockstep with Donald J. Trump, Mike Pompeo, and every other Republican. If he really cared about the human rights of Nicaraguans, he would immediately first of all, be calling for reparations to Nicaragua for the terror war that the US waged there. I mean, there's even a world court judgment that in the 1980s that ordered the US to pay reparations to Nicaragua for mining the harbor. That's just one aspect of the terror war that the US waged. Is the US mined Nicaragua's harbor, but there's many more atrocities that the US carried out by arming basically a Contra army and funding a Contra army to terrorize the Nicaraguan population. So he'd be calling for reparations, and then now, I mean, look, you go to today, and the fact is, there's so much propaganda, which is always the case. I mean, look, everyone should know this now. You remember how when there was a coup in Bolivia, there were some leftists coming out and saying, well,
but
Evo stole the election and he, blah, blah, blah. There's always things that are come up that are conjured to justify starving a population that the US wants to overthrow. And Khanna is completely fallen for that here. And again, by the way, what right do we have to deny Nicaraguans, food and medicine and international investments? I mean, it's like the question, like his answer presumes that we have some kind of right. Why? Because are we a supreme race? Are we better than Nicaraguans? Do we have the right to tell them how their government should run? You're interested in Nicaragua, which is having elections today, which if you read in the US corporate media, they're being demonized as this like rigged thing. And, this dictator Ortega is rigging it all for himself. I really want to if you're interested in Nicaragua, and everyone should be. I mean, it's a fascinating country, but also there's such a rich history, and it's a heavily US tied history, going back, to the early 20th century, where you have just decades of the US intervening, occupying Nicaragua, installing dictators, propping them up. And then in the 80s, you have the terror war where, after the Sandinistas overthrew the US-backed Somoza regime, the US under Reagan waged this catastrophic dirty war against Nicaragua, and Nicaragua bravely resisted it. And so that's, and the impact of that is still being felt today. And the goal of destroying the Sandinista movement is still being undertaken today by the US and Washington. And it's very hard to get accurate reporting on it. But one noble exception is the gray zone where I work, but it's my colleagues like Ben Norton and Max Blumenthal who have been exposing the US role in destabilizing Nicaragua and continuing this longstanding goal of turning Nicaragua into a US colony, unable to, conduct its own affairs as it wishes. And Ben Norton actually lives in Nicaragua. So from there, he's just put out a whole bunch of reports that I think are just such great pieces of journalism and just such a window into how sadistic US foreign policy is. Like the lengths that it goes to try to punish small nations that pose no threat to anyone, simply because they refuse to be subordinate to US power. And simply because they provide an example to other nations that want to run their own affairs and use their own resources for their own people. So I recommend people go and look to really understand what's going on in Nicaragua and to offer a corrective to the corporate media and unfortunately some progressive media too that have drank the Kool-Aid